and welcome to Critical Conversations. My name is Lydia Woody, and today I'm excited to have some guest speakers to discuss a man who is perceived by many as the father of modern Turkey, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. The Republic of Turkey was established via the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923. Ataturk was a secularist and a Turkish nationalist who desired to create a Turkish identity that was based on a unity of culture rather than ethnicity. He was also considered by some to be a feminist. Ataturk, however, is surrounded by controversy, so we have designed today's podcast to answer the following question. What were the negative impacts of Ataturk's widely revered secularist and nationalist policies? In order to answer this question, one of my colleagues, Melissa Clark, will illustrate many of Ataturk's accolades, while our three guest speakers will provide some critique and refutations of the arguments of my colleague. So, without further ado, let me introduce you to our three guest speakers. Emily Coleman, a graduate of Princeton and an author of numerous works regarding women and Islam. McKenna Awney, a graduate of Brown who has devoted most of her scholarly career to studying Kurdish people in Turkey. And Aubrey Harris, a graduate of Columbia University who has spent many years in Turkey researching Ataturk's role in establishing the Republic of Turkey.
Thank you so much for having us here today. We're so honored to be on your show and to have the privilege to discuss a topic we're very passionate about.
We're so happy to have you here today. Aubrey, would you please give us a brief synopsis of what we'll be arguing here today?
Yeah, I would love to. Emily, McKenna, and I will be discussing three of the most common and established critiques of Ataturk: his policies regarding women, treatment of the Kurds, as well as policies regarding the practice of Islam. These three areas of research demonstrate the problematic and even harmful impacts of Ataturk's agenda.
Wonderful. Let's get started. Our first topic today is Ataturk's policies regarding women and their rights. Emily, the floor is yours.
To tackle this question of whether Ataturk's project had a negative impact, we must acknowledge that westernizing reforms are often uncritically depicted as progressive. Bayrou Baskin, a scholar published in the Journal of Women in the Middle East and the Islamic World, asserts that this Orientalist assumption must be dropped in order to truly assess the impact and motives of Ataturk. So I'll briefly establish how Ataturk and his policies failed women.
Please go ahead and give us some insight into how women may have been negatively impacted by Ataturk and his policies.
Well, first, women were strategically used as symbols of Ataturk's modernization project.
How so?
Murv Kavaki Islam suggests that by granting women rights, Ataturk was able to promote Turkey to a higher ranking among Western democracies. So undoubtedly, Ataturk would gain political power if Europe and the U.S. regarded Turkey as superior to other Muslim countries.
It is important, though, to keep in mind that in October of 1926, Turkey adopted the Swiss Civil Code. This gave women much better standing in society. It gave them the right to divorce, outlawed polygamy, created a minimum age for marriage, and women were legal equals of men in courts and inheritance. Women also gained the right to choose their spouse and maintain custody after divorce. On the political front, Ataturk gave women the right to both vote and run for office. Works such as The Modernization of Turkish Women by Nermin Abdan Unat discussed the Swiss Civil Code at a great length. However, overall, it seems like it was a major advancement in the battle of women's rights and equality. Do the motives of modernization really matter if it did so much to benefit women?
Well, actually, Bayrou Baskin combines 8 authors' ideas into a feminist critique of Ataturk, and he suggests that the civil code contained non-egalitarian elements. So, for example, the code recognized the husband as the head of the family. Women were in a secondary position where they participate in the household, must ask their husband for permission to work outside of the house, and the code also took away marriage contracts, which was a form of bargaining power for women.
But the amount of political power that women gained, like the right to vote and run for office, placed them on a path towards progress, regardless of Ataturk's intentions.
Kavaki Islam, a Turkish politician, suggests that Ataturk's regime made women equal with certain rights, but blocked their progress at each step to maintain the patriarchy. When women were granted the right to be elected and vote, they formed the Women's People Party, which was abolished in 1923. Then women formed the Women's League of Turkey, which was also abolished, and the Republican People's Party, founded by Ataturk, denied women membership. the regime's justification for abolishing women's political parties was that the goals of the Women's Party were met by the state, so naturally there was no need for its existence. Altogether, I would say this suggests that Ataturk was driven by political aims and not women's equality. Baskin stresses the importance of situating Ataturk's policies in the historical context, which I think this reminds me a lot of Fatima Mernissi's approach to women in the Quran.
Interesting. So Melissa is mentioning the fact that even though there may have been motives that caused Ataturk to create policies that seemed beneficial to women, it could be seen as a step forward compared to what it was before, even if it wasn't as good as we might like. Whereas Emily, you're saying that there wasn't much progress for women at all, because the institutions that oppressed women were still active and strong.
Yeah, so a final argument I'd like to support is one made by Metin Yüksel, a political and social activist from Turkey. The regime's aim was to create a homogeneous nation from the Ottoman Empire, which was multi-ethnic, linguistic, and cultural. The new republic was based solely on Turkish identity and culture, and other identities were suppressed. Kurdish people were the largest linguistic minority, and Yüksel argues that Kurdish women were doubly marginalized by Ataturk's regime, because their ethnic identity was crushed and they were disadvantaged compared to Turkish women. This is clear with Ataturk's free obligatory primary education, because it was taught in Turkish and the Kurdish language was not permitted.
So you're claiming that Kurdish women were particularly repressed. That's actually a really good transition into our next topic. But first, let me take a moment to thank our sponsors. I would like to thank Willamette University's Religion Department for helping sponsor this podcast, as well as the Bistro for sponsoring us and providing caffeine to students everywhere. Welcome back to Critical Conversations. Today we're having a discussion about Ataturk and his policies in Turkey and the controversy that surrounds them. McKenna, would you like to talk a little bit about the Kurdish people in Turkey?
I would love to. In Ataturk and the Kurds, Andrew Mango utilizes telegrams and other primary sources to draw attention to Ataturk's exploitative treatment of the Kurds. Mango illustrates how during Ataturk's military career, a time when British troops were attempting to establish an independent Kurdistan in Turkey, Ataturk regularly wrote to Kurdish leaders to promote the idea of unity and brotherhood. Furthermore, at that time, Ataturk also informed Kurdish leaders that once Turkey gained independence, the Kurdish people would have their own independent governments. However, after Ataturk ascended to power and no longer needed the cooperation of the Kurdish people, his aforementioned agreements were completely ignored.
However, even though Ataturk's treatment was exploitive, his goal was to create a unified Turkey, and in order to do so, he needed to ensure that the Kurdish people of Turkey did not side with the British. He was trying to mend the wounds left by the Ottoman Empire and help his people move forward unified.
I do see where you're coming from with the benefits of having a unified Turkey, but it's difficult to ignore the fact that the Kemalist government did actively attempt to erase Kurdish people and their identity.
Exactly. As Hai Eten Kohan Yanorokak demonstrates in his 2016 research, the state took all mention of Kurds out of textbooks, history, civics, and national security. Kurdish people were even eventually referred to as violent extremist terrorists simply for wanting to be recognized as Kurdish. Ataturk outlawed the use of words referring to Kurdish identity in 1925 and even implemented a resettlement law, which allowed the state to uproot Kurdish people and force them to assimilate into more Turkish cities.
Contrastly, as I and other scholars would argue, the actions Ataturk took to unify the nation and stop the Kurds from establishing an independent state stopped serious violence within the country between the two ethnic groups.
Actually, in the 1920s and 1930s, there was major violent conflict between the Kurdish people and the Turkish government. The Dersim Rebellion was particularly violent. As Mehmet Orhan explains, in Kurdish rebellions and conflict groups in Turkey during the 1920s and 1930s, the Turkish government's authority in the Dersim region was very weak, due to Kurdish proto-nationalism and active resistance of the Kurdish people with regards to taxes, military, and civilian disarmament. Thusly, the state attempted to gain more power in that area through military recruitment, the construction of judicial offices, civil law enforcement, and the destruction of tribe politics and political elites. Overall, the state military operations in the Dersim region killed thousands of civilians.
Thank you for that insight, McKenna. Now we're going to move on to another area of Ataturk's reform, which tried to change the culture of people and fit into his vision of a modern and westernized Turkey, the culture of Islam. Aubrey, will you weigh in on the aspects of Ataturk's policies regarding Islam?
Ataturk attempted to make the Quran more accessible to the Turkish people by having it translated into Turkish from Arabic. In January of 1925, 70,000 people came to the first reading of the Quran in Turkish at the Mosque of the Sultan Ahmet. This made the Quran and the religion of Islam accessible for the people of Turkey no matter what their education level was.
Yes, however, it also isolated the Turkish Muslims from Muslims in other countries. Ataturk may have made the Quran more accessible, but his motivation was to westernize the religion and to remove the cultural influence that Arabic had on the religion. Many Muslim scholars in the time even argued that it took away from the meaning of the text and was not God's word. Furthermore, there were people such as the Kurds, who were mentioned earlier, who did not speak Arabic or Turkish and were not able to afford or allowed to learn the language.
However, just because a text is translated doesn't mean it cannot still say what it was intended to. Works are translated into other languages constantly in the modern world, and they're not drastically changed from their original meanings. Regardless of his intentions, Ataturk still helped make the religion available to his people.
But the accessibility of the religion does not make up for the detriment he did to the culture of Muslims by making this change. He required the Ezan, Tekbir, and Salatu Salam to be done in Turkish in 1925. And unlike the translation of the Quran, did not give the people a choice in the language they practiced in.
Interesting points. I'd like to hear about his policies on the fez. On March 4th, 1925, a law was enacted that made it illegal to wear a fez in public, and in all other acts seen as disturbance to public's social structures, laws, and safety were banned. From these laws, there were 57 executions and over 800 arrests in only 2 months. Dr. Harris, would you like to start us off?
Gladly. Ataturk mistakenly assumed that by looking Western in attire, Turkey would become Western. The drive behind this policy was to make Europe perceive Turkey as Western. However, just because the country looked Western did not equate it to being modernized or having other Western qualities, as the research of Camila Nereid points out. The country falsely acting Western only highlighted the differences between Turkey and the West.
The fez was a symbol used by the Ottoman Republic to unify the people and to minimize the class warfare. The fez was just a reminder of the old Ottoman regime and the failure of it. Ataturk was trying to make his people hold more national pride for the new country of Turkey and to not be stuck in the past feeling ashamed for their old country.
Actually, Ataturk was just embarrassed after going to Italy wearing a fez and being made fun of and stared at by children that he felt his country was the laughingstock of the world and wanted other nations to see it in a positive light.
Well, I hate to interrupt interesting conversation, but it looks like we're running out of time for this episode of Critical Conversations. As you can see, Ataturk and his policies are surrounded by a lot of controversy, with compelling points to be made both for and against him and his goals. Though he was, and still to a certain extent is, revered and respected as a historical figure, the research mentioned by my esteemed guest demonstrates that Ataturk's goal of creating a unified, secular, and culturally consistent Turkey were done at the cost of more meaningful progress for women's rights. Further, it created suffering and inequality for smaller ethnic groups such as the Kurds. Also, his policies on Islam may have taken the religion out of the people's hands and made it in some ways less accessible to any non-wealthy person. Lastly, I would like to thank my guests, Emily, Melissa, McKenna, and Aubrey. Thank you for providing such thought-provoking ideas and information today. I'm Lydia Woody, and thanks for listening to Critical Conversations.